How do you go from introverted air traffic controller to podcast host and successful entrepreneur with a roster of clients around the world? Well, my guest today did just that, and she's an amazing human being who came on the podcast to talk about how ambitious introverts can really make it in the world of business by getting visible. Her podcast is actually called The Ambitious Introvert, and Emma-Louise Parkes and I met through the podcasting world. I was a guest on her podcast talking about camera confidence for introverts, and now she joins me on this podcast to talk all about how people who don't necessarily love being around people all the time can use their visibility to their advantage to really supercharge their business and see results. She shares some real tips about how to make this work for you, especially if you're someone who needs a lot of alone time. So you won't want to miss this episode. Here's my interview with Emma-Louise Parkes. Welcome to Camera Confident. I am so excited to speak to Emma-Louise Parkes today of the Ambitious Introvert podcast. Emma, thanks so much for being on the show.
This is a delight. This is the third time I've got to speak to you in about 6 weeks. So this is wonderful.
It's amazing. And when you and I first connected, it was like we've known each other for years, and you just have that connection with some people. One of the reasons for that is because your story captivated me from the moment that I heard how you started, which was as an air traffic controller. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's like that was my whole career was aviation before I started my own business. So I was in aviation for 23 years, which is insane. And I was an air traffic controller for 17 of those. And honestly, I overheard someone talking about the job and I thought it sounded pretty interesting. It's like, oh yeah, okay. That sounds kind of cool. Maybe I'll give it a go. And I went home to my then boyfriend, who was an airline pilot, and I said, this girl at work was talking about air traffic control. I might give it a go. It sounds kind of interesting. And he went, oh, don't bother. I applied 3 times and I didn't get in, so you've got no chance. So I went, challenge accepted. And I applied and got in the first time. So there we have it. And it was that curiosity. I'm a very curious person. That sounds interesting. I didn't know that much about it. I just thought, that sounds interesting. Let's go into it and have a look.
So you had voice training from day one. You were literally the voice I had in my ear. If I was a pilot and shit was about to hit the fan, you were the person who would calmly lead me to my destination.
Correct. And before that, my first 6 years in aviation, I was a flight attendant. So I was the voice that told you, in the event of a landing on water, please make sure that you remove all high-heeled shoes, etc., etc.
So did you undergo any voice coaching to do that job?
No, not at all, which I think is so fun because I asked you the same question on my podcast as a news anchor and you were like, no, not at all. So no, I didn't. No, but what is really important is when you're speaking to pilots, so we have really standard phraseology in air traffic control in aviation. English is the first language of aviation, luckily for me, because if it had been anything else, I would have been out. But we have these standard phrases and standard words that we use because a lot of foreign pilots, English isn't their first or even their second language. So enunciating in a way that make those words crystal clear is obviously vital. So it's more practice than training because you start to notice if you say things in a way and someone doesn't hear it first time or they question it or say, oh, can you say that again? Or they don't quite understand it. So it was a lot more of on the job practice of, when I say 5, I really have to like enunciate it like 5 because otherwise it can sound like 9 and all of these different things. So, like anything actually official training? No, other than my mentors saying, speak louder or speak more clearly. But so much of it was just learned on the job, exactly the same as you said.
That's incredible, especially since all I'm doing is video and you were literally navigating pilots through the skies. There wasn't a lot of margin for error there. I mean, you were on every moment that you were on the air with those pilots. So you're an introvert. You are the host of the Ambitious Introvert podcast. Where I wanted to start was, where do you find that confidence and that ability to speak like that to total strangers and, be that persona when, perhaps that you're not feeling up to it on a particular day?
I think what's funny with it is I have always been interested in communication in all different facets, and I studied communication at college before going into aviation. And obviously 80% of our communication is body language. And then I found it so interesting that you take that away and strip that back, and you are using only your voice to be able to not just communicate, but to communicate effectively and in a way that you need, 15 foreign pilots to be able to understand it at the same time. And I don't know if it's a confidence thing as much as a curiosity. Like I say, I'm very curious. So when I started to sit like, well, how does this work? And how do we communicate with each other? And what are these phrases? And what do they mean? And what's the kind of back and forth? And what are all the different workflows within it? Because like anything else, right, there's a workflow in communication for aviation. And I remember just being so fascinated by it. And then I do remember the first day that I spoke to an actual live aeroplane after, 2 years or whatever of training in the simulator and going, oh my God, it's actually like there's actual people on there. This is an actual person. But you get over that pretty quickly because your bandwidth is taken up with making the plans and executing the plans and keeping everything moving.
So bridge us, if you can, between being the voice in the pilot's ear and the host of the Ambitious Introvert podcast, successful entrepreneur who's been at it for many more years than I have. How did you make that leap, and what prompted you to become a podcast host and an entrepreneur and a coach?
It's so funny because a lot of people don't see the connection, or they go, wow, that's a huge leap from one thing to another. It's so diverse. And I go, it feels kind of normal, but that's because it was me going through it, right? So part of my role in air traffic was training new trainees. So I was a mentor and coach for new air traffic controllers from 2009. So I was doing that role as well as controlling. I got really, really interested in mindset, actually, and confidence through that, because so much of the job is confidence, as you can imagine. If you go, turn left, the pilots are going to be like, yeah, right, whatever. But if you can speak really confidently, yeah, exactly. That's not what you want. But if you can speak confidently what you're saying and keep the flow going, people trust you, people, will take action, they'll do what you say. It just makes like the whole thing flow much more easily. So I got really interested in that. I got really interested in language. I was already interested in communication. So I did another coaching certification after my mentorship one, which was in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. And from there, that was 2015, and I started to think, maybe I could do something outside of this. Until that point, I thought I would be in that job for life until I retired. And then I just started to feel that itch of, this could be fun. What else is out there? And I just started to explore, like, can you be a coach online? And it turned out that you could. So from 2016 to probably 2018, I did a lot of research and not much action. And then in 2019, I decided to go all in and set something up. And in 2020, I went full time. And here we are.
So tell us about the genesis of the Ambitious Introvert podcast. What prompted you to become a podcaster? And how was that different for you than the voice work you were doing as an air traffic controller?
So I was really an early adopter listening to podcasts. I remember listening to Tim Ferriss and Dave Asprey when their podcasts were very, very new, like, episode 10 or something like that. And they're probably both on thousands by now. And it was a medium that suited me really well. I used to drive home from work, listen to podcasts, potter around, listen to podcasts. And around the time that I was thinking of niching down, I didn't know it was going to be introverts at this point, but around that time I thought, maybe I'd like to have a podcast one day. So it was just this kind of fun thought. And then when I niched down to introverts, it coincided with working with a new one-on-one coach. And our very first call, she said, tell me about your business. And I said, well, I've actually just decided to niche down into introverts. And she was like, oh, I'm an introvert. I was like, yay, this is great. She said, do you have a podcast? I went, no, but I want one. And she said, introverts love a podcast. You should have a podcast. And I went, okay. And she went, what are you going to call it? And I went, the Ambitious Introvert podcast. And she was like, great. That was the first 2 minutes of our call. And that was how it was born.
Why don't we take a quick step back? What is an introvert? How do I know if I'm an introvert?
So there are many different theories and definitions online, but let's go back to Carl Jung, because he invented the term and he was the one that's, really done all the groundwork for everything. So it's to do with two things: how you recharge your energy and how deeply you process information. So introverts recharge their energy by being alone, and they will get drained in company, in groups, in crowds, even with people they love, and groups that they really enjoy. Over time, it will deplete their energy and they will need to remove themselves and recharge. Extroverts being the opposite, extroverts finding that if they spend too much time alone, they will start to feel depleted and they'll be really craving that connection from people to charge them back up. A lot of my extroverted friends struggled in lockdown because they couldn't connect, get out the house and see people. And then the second part is the depth of processing. So introverts do process things very, very deeply. They much prefer deep conversations. They like to take information and sit with it and internalize it because, intro. And, this can show up in a lot of ways. People say, oh, introverts don't speak up in meetings. Well, no, because they sat kind of processing the information and taking it on. But people can see it as, oh, they're too nervous to speak up, or they're too shy, or they're socially anxious, or they feel awkward, or any of these things. So it kind of gets conflated with these personality traits like shyness, which has got absolutely nothing to do with. It is how you recharge your energy and how deeply you process information.
That's amazing, because I think one of the reasons you and I get along so well is because we are opposites. I'm an extrovert. I feed off of other people's energy, and you're an introvert. But there's so many misconceptions. Even
so many.
I think I wrongly assumed before I met you, actually. And one of the reasons I love speaking to you is because I always thought introverts were shy. They maybe lacked confidence, but that is actually not the case at all. So can you explain, because you're a very visible person now. We talk all about visibility on this podcast, and yet you're an introvert, but you're so visible. So did you struggle with getting visible as an introvert? And was that because of shyness or confidence? Or take us through your experience.
I definitely struggled, 1000% struggled. I do not think it was confidence or shyness for me personally. I think that I'm of an age where I missed most of the social media, when it first came out, and selfies and all of that stuff. I was already a bit older. I wasn't on any of these platforms. And to me, taking a selfie and sharing a selfie was just a very, I didn't get it. I was like, why do I want to do that? That's just weird. Or, people would be like, oh, show your holiday pictures. And I'd be like, well, I'll share them on WhatsApp with friends. Introvert, right? Such an introvert thing, deeper one-on-one connections. And then when it came to business, people were, explaining, and I got the concept that people need to see your face. No one's going to probably buy from you if they haven't seen your face. It's a big connection piece. It's a big trust piece, which now, of course, I totally understand. So I had to make that, I guess, that switch from, oh, this is me being vain and just showing my face on social media for the sake of it, to, oh, this is a business and I'm the face of this business. And it was a personal brand at the time. It wasn't even the Ambitious Introvert. It was Emma-Louise Parkes. That's people really need to see Emma-Louise Parkes to understand what the brand is. So when I switched it to a more marketing and sales psychology perspective, I was like, oh, this makes so much sense into why I would show up and why people would see my face. I'm not just doing it for the sake of it. If I understand the reason, if I can, if I get the theory behind it, I'm more than happy to go along with it.
You said that when you first met with your coach, she said, tell me about your business. So one of the things we like to do on the Camera Confident podcast is get your elevator pitch.
Oh my
I had to
God.
start with your air traffic controller stuff, but I'd love to hear, what is your elevator pitch for your business?
I love it. What a great question. So I help ambitious introverts to manage their energy so that they can reach their potential.
I love that. So, what does that mean exactly? Break it down for us. What specific challenges do introverts face to grow their businesses?
So I always break it down into three things, and that is their mindset, their physical energy, and their spirituality. Which always people are like, oh, interesting. But mindset, our brain uses 80% of our energy. And if we're in a thought loop and we're thinking thoughts that are not empowering and not helpful for us, or if we're being perfectionist or procrastinating or any of these things that as business owners we can tend to do, that takes up so much of our energy that we feel like, many of my clients will say they feel like they are working full time in their business. When we distill it down, they're actually maybe spending an hour or two a day doing anything that's effective because they're overthinking a lot of the time. So we've really got to start with the mindset and how much energy is going there and how much energy is being wasted on thoughts that are either repetitive or just not very helpful. And then physical energy, again, spending time alone is the biggest one. A lot of introverts don't recognize that they really need that. Like you say, there's these myths about, oh, they're shy and they're awkward. So they'll be like, oh, well, I'm an introvert, so that means I can't come on video. Or, oh, I'm an introvert, so that means I'm not very good with people. None of those things are true. But what it does mean is you have to spend time alone or you will not recharge. And actually, a lot of my clients look and they spend very little time alone, or when they are quote unquote alone, they're actually scrolling social media or watching YouTube or chatting with friends on WhatsApp. And it's like, is that alone? And they're like, oh, yeah, no, I suppose it's probably not. So, really managing that physical energy, not just about being away from people, but also with sleep, with nutrition, with movement, with screen time, with all of these things to make sure that their battery is as full as possible. And then for the spiritual, it's really having that connection to self. A lot of introverts are very intuitive, but lose that self-trust over time, especially if they've been in corporate roles. So really having a connection to their core values, a connection to higher purpose, some kind of spiritual practice. That's not to say they've got to become like all woo-woo or, become very religious or anything, but understanding that there's another dimension that when they tap into, it will help them to own their energy. So that's the trifecta really of making sure that their energy is as powerful and potent as possible so they don't exhaust themselves while they're building these amazing careers and businesses.
I mean, it sounds like all things that extroverts should do as well, maybe with the recharging yourself with people. I know for myself as an extrovert, I have to see my friends
Oh, yeah.
frequently. I mean, I have an incredible husband, two beautiful daughters. Obviously, they're always here, and my dog. But I get a certain kind of recharging of my batteries with friends that's a different kind of energy than family brings. So I think whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, knowing what those things are and how you recharge your batteries, I think one thing we can all agree on is that social media drains those batteries. So I would love to know from the perspective of an introvert and for the audience and for people who are like, I feel like I don't have time to be alone. Like there's too many things in my business. So I would love to know, I'm all about practical examples and actionable tips. Can you take us through your workflow? Because you're an ambitious introvert, you're a successful businesswoman and introvert, and you have a podcast where you're quite visible. So, can you take us through what that looks like for you? How do you optimize your schedule so you can keep showing up and be consistent, but still fill your cup when you need to, so that when you do show up, you're showing up as your best self?
I batch everything. That is my secret. I am a batcher. So I batch podcast recordings. I batch recording solo episodes, I batch writing the show notes, and I give myself a lot of space. So everything is done at least 2 weeks out, sometimes more, sometimes 4 to 6. Like now, where are we at the end of October? I'm now thinking about over the holidays, what's going to be released and making sure that that is created and batched. So I find that switching between tasks is the worst thing for me. And also having tight deadlines is not great for me because I start to flap and get a bit like by it all. So if I can record out, like say a month or 6 weeks in advance and know that that's there and it's ready, pass it on to, I'm very lucky to have a great team. I have an editor, and then I have a social media manager who, deals with it being posted everywhere online. But for me, in my energy is best when I batch. And that's the funny thing, because people say, introverts get tired. We do get tired doing things that don't light us up. I love interviewing people for the podcast. I can interview 4 people in a day and I come off the end of it and I feel great. I'm like, yay. So it's knowing that is something that lights me up. That's something that I enjoy. It's something that I'm good at, but I wouldn't want to be doing it spread over 5 days of the week. So making sure that I've got that, Wednesday's a podcast day, and doing the bits that I need to do, and then making sure, luckily I've got a solid team in place that can take the bits that I would not be very good at.
A lot of the listeners and viewers of this podcast are newer entrepreneurs who are just starting on their journey. They're looking to get more confident and more visible. And for a lot of them, podcasting feels like this heavy lift, like, oh, then I got to show up every week. It feels very overwhelming. So what is your advice, especially to the introverts who are tuning in, who have this ambition to really get out there and get visible, but feel so overwhelmed by everything involved and all the moving parts, to the point that it does sometimes lead to that sort of paralysis, procrastination, and not taking that step?
I think, like anything, it felt huge when I was starting the podcast. It felt huge the first time I showed my face on social media, like any of these things. And it did feel like there were a lot of moving parts, and I was stretched so far out of my comfort zone, even though I'd been talking into a microphone for 17 years, right? It was still completely different. And what I remembered is that in the 2 years previous that I'd been building my business, everything felt hard at first. And, showing my face on social media felt hard, or writing a newsletter felt hard. And then it became more standard. And so I took that approach with the podcast. I was like, of course this feels icky. Of course I feel a little bit exhausted and a little bit intimidated by it, because it's new and I'm not used to it. But the one thing that I knew about a podcast, and introverts listen up, because this is the biggest secret, I think, in marketing that people don't talk enough about, is it is really potent evergreen content. And if I spend 20 minutes recording a podcast, that is much better than spending 20 minutes recording an Instagram story that's going to disappear in 24 hours. When in fact, my podcast is going to live on forever on my blog, on iTunes, on Spotify. And people find it and they say to me, I've just found your podcast and I'm going back to listen from the beginning. I've got 4 years worth now, just over 4 years worth. So yes, it feels like a big lift. Yes, it feels like a time investment. It feels like these moving parts, but it's a piece of content that will live forever, and that you can repurpose numerous pieces of content from social media, blog posts, newsletters, all the good stuff.
So 4 years of podcasting, of being visible. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
Incredible. How has this built and transformed your business?
Oh, so I began in October 2020, and I signed 2 clients in December 2020 that hadn't found me through the podcast, but they had listened to all 8 episodes or whatever was out at the time. And that was the key to them deciding to work with me, because they'd either, one had been recommended, one had found me on social media, but it was the podcast that they went, yeah, I listened to that. And, absolutely. In the first 6 months, I think 2 to 3 of my guests became clients, which was wild to me. That was completely something I didn't see coming. So it helped me to build my network. It helped me to meet great people like yourself and have these conversations and expand my network in that way. And then in let me get this right, in Q3 of 2023, 80-something% of my revenue came directly from the podcast. So whether that was clients that had already signed up and re-signed with me, or brand new clients. And I think it was something like 30-odd thousand US in a quarter.
Wow.
And it was directly attributable to the podcast.
And does your podcast have ads, or is this monetizing through actual business,
It's
actual
actual
client.
coaching clients. Yeah. Yeah.
So you are a perfect example of how visibility equals revenue.
Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah. And I resisted it for so long, but it's true. It's absolutely true. I would also add to that consistency creates revenue. And as a coach, I know that showing up consistently on my podcast helps people to understand what it would be like to work with me, to show up consistently, to get on a call every week, every 2 weeks. So, yes, visibility, but also the consistency piece. I think that having a body of work like a podcast, first of all, it lets people feel our energy or see our energy in your case, because you do video, right? Mine's audio only. But it lets people understand your energy in a way that's different to written. And that's not to say there's anything wrong with written posts. I write a newsletter. I'm all for that. But it just so happens that my skill is in speaking rather than writing. So it also happens that what I do with my clients is speaking. We're on calls, we're speaking, right? We're in Slack, we're speaking, we're voice noting. So I think it's a really great way to build that trust and let people kind of sample what it's like to spend time in your energy.
Yeah, and I mean, I love your energy. I love your aura, and I just find maybe it's the air traffic controller, but I just find your voice so lovely and velvety. So I can imagine why, driving in your car and a lot of the activities where we listen to podcasts, having that voice in your ear. So you have the how to say it, I like to call it, but you also have the what to say because you've got you're obviously certified. I mean, you have the qualifications, but you live by this, right? But you live by this. So you come at this from personal experience, and there's nothing that builds that know, like, and trust factor than actually walking your talk, right? Like you're not just talking about this in theory. You've actually built a successful business by getting outside your comfort zone as an introvert and really sticking with it. I mean, and that consistency, I love that you brought it up because that is so important. What is your advice to people who are sort of feeling like they're locked in? Some people will call it 200 views jail on Instagram, or maybe they have a podcast and it's just not getting the pickup or growing. How did you grow your podcast to the powerhouse that it is today? And what advice would you have for other entrepreneurs who really want to get visible through podcasting, but feel like it's so crowded right now?
I'm actually walking a client through this at this very moment. I have helped 9 clients start their podcast and obviously started my own. And every single person, including myself, goes, I just don't want to add to the noise. Does the world really need another podcast? And all of these great things. So yes, the world does need another podcast because they need your podcast. Whoever you are, whatever you've got to say is different. There are other introvert podcasts out there, but they've got a slightly different flavor to me. They've got a different energy. They're talking to a different aspect of introversion. And some people will much prefer their podcast to mine. Some people will much prefer mine to them. The way I built it, I would say it's a top 2% podcast now. It's just gone into the top 2% this year. For the first 2.5 years, the growth was very consistent. Like I didn't go viral and have a massive spike or anything like that. But each month, downloads were up. I did have one crazy spike because I recorded an episode about ChatGPT, and I think Apple Podcasts picked it up. So where every other episode was getting like 200 downloads, that got like 1,500.
Wow.
Something like that, which was quite wild. But then after that week, it kind of went down and carried on again. But for the most, it's been, steady, slow, consistent growth, which I think people can feel really frustrated with. But I took that as a good sign. I was like, even if I'm keeping the same amount of listeners, that's good. If I'm losing listeners, then maybe we've got an issue here and I need to think about it. And then I made some changes to the podcast about a year ago, and the growth kind of plateaued a little bit. But when I looked at the last year's figures, 50% of listeners were new. So it made sense. I'd made changes. I'd stopped talking about business as much. So I lost some of those listeners. Also, a lot of people that started businesses in lockdown last year went back to employment. It makes sense that there was an attrition there. And that meant that 50% of my listeners were new, which was great because I'm like, people are still discovering me and finding me. So I'm not about quick wins and I'm not about big sexy numbers. I'm about, is it growing? Am I getting great feedback? Are people listening for a long period of time? And they are. I've got people that have listened since day one. I have private clients who still listen. I love that. They're like, oh, I listened to your podcast this week. And I'm like, do you not get sick of me?
I love that. I know. I got an email from a client the other day and it was like, oh, I loved your latest podcast episode. And I'm like, they still listen. They love me. Like, when people get into your world, if they like your aura and they like your energy and you're offering value, then why wouldn't they listen to you, right? You've become almost like a part of their world. You're in their network and you're someone who they will come back to again and again if you're genuine, if you're authentic, and if you are there for the right reasons. Because people can really see through a lot of that kind of fake bro marketing, like, you know, if you're really just starting a podcast to make sales, it will show. People will feel that in your content.
And, I have been criticized in the past by coaches I've worked with for not monetizing the podcast more. I could have ads, I could have sponsorships. I've got the number of downloads now. Maybe I will. It would have to be very aligned. I would be like meticulous about that. But also, I don't often sell my own services on there. I mean, this year a lot of my work comes through corporate avenues anyway, but this year I've only been taking one-on-one clients. I do occasionally remember to say at the end of the podcast, oh, if you'd like to work with me, like fill in this form. But for the most, I'm not. And I don't need to, because people that want to take that next step, they know what to do. They know to, head to my website and find out how to work with me. So maybe that is part of its success as well. Yes, it is a lead generation podcast. It is part of my marketing for my business, but I'm not spending every episode selling to people.
I love that. So if you could give people listening one piece of advice, if they can remember one thing that you said, what would that be? What's your headline out of this episode?
My headline would be, remember that the first time you do anything, it is going to feel uncomfortable because it's new and it's different and it's unknown. And that is, our brain doesn't like that. But know that the second time you do it, it will feel less uncomfortable. And the third time it will feel less again. And by the 30th time, it will feel normal and you will wonder what you were even worried about. So that doesn't mean, people take this fear of, like, let's just say visibility, like a fear of showing up and showing their face. They take that to mean they shouldn't do it. No, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means that this is the scariest it's ever going to be. And as you continue and be consistent, it's just going to feel less and less and less challenging.
And you're a perfect picture of that. Thank you, Emma, so much for joining me on the Camera Confident podcast. If people do want to get in touch with you and learn more, what's the best place to connect with you?
Well, obviously the podcast, the Ambitious Introvert podcast. You can also find me at theambitiousintrovert.com or on Instagram or LinkedIn. And both of those are Emma-Louise Parkes, all one word.
Nice. And we'll link that in the show notes so you can connect with Emma if what she's saying resonates with you. Thank you again for coming on the podcast. I hope we can do this again soon.
Thank you. I know. I don't know what else we can do. We've had a coffee chat. We've done 2 podcast interviews. Well, I know we'll have to do a summit or something. We'll just have to keep finding ways to connect.
Yeah. Yin and yang. The extrovert.
Yes,
and the
exactly.
extrovert.
Exactly.
I love it. Let us know if you want to attend that. Thanks for listening to Camera Confident. Help us grow by subscribing, liking, and sharing this podcast. And be sure to follow me on LinkedIn at Shirley Engel and on Instagram at b.camera.confident. See you next time.